Moses was born in Egypt during a dark and dangerous time for his people, the Israelites. Pharaoh, fearing the growing Hebrew population, ordered that all newborn Hebrew boys be killed. But Moses' mother, driven by love and faith, refused to let her son die. She hid him for as long as she could, and when it became too dangerous, she placed him in a basket made of reeds and set him afloat on the Nile River. The waters carried him downstream until Pharaoh's daughter found the basket among the reeds. Touched by the sight of the infant, she took him in as her own son, raising him in the grand halls of the Egyptian palace, unaware of his true heritage. As Moses grew, he lived the life of Egyptian royalty, learning the ways of the palace and being treated as a prince. But deep inside, he felt different. As a young man, Moses discovered his true identity as a Hebrew, one of the very people Pharaoh oppressed. His heart was troubled as he witnessed the suffering of the Israelites, forced into brutal labor and treated with cruelty by the Egyptians. One day, while walking among the Hebrew workers, Moses saw an Egyptian taskmaster viciously beating a Hebrew slave. Filled with righteous anger, Moses intervened, killing the Egyptian and hiding his body in the sand. When Pharaoh learned of this, Moses feared for his life and fled Egypt, leaving behind the only life he had ever known. Moses wandered into the desert and eventually settled in the land of Midian, far from the reaches of Pharaoh's power. There he found refuge with the family of Jethro, a priest of Midian, and married his daughter Zipporah. Moses became a shepherd, leading his father-in-law's flocks across the vast barren wilderness. He lived a quiet and humble life for many years, far removed from the turmoil of Egypt. But Moses' destiny was far greater than he could have imagined. One day, while tending his sheep near Mount Horeb, he came upon an extraordinary sight: a bush engulfed in flames, yet not consumed by the fire. As Moses approached, a voice called to him from the burning bush. It was the voice of God telling Moses to remove his sandals, for he stood on holy ground. God revealed that he had heard the cries of the Israelites and had chosen Moses to lead them out of slavery and into freedom. Though Moses was reluctant and filled with doubt about his abilities, God assured him that he would be with him every step of the way. With a heavy heart, Moses returned to Egypt, this time not as a prince, but as a messenger of God. Alongside his brother Aaron, Moses stood before Pharaoh and delivered God's command, "Let my people go." But Pharaoh, stubborn and proud, refused to release the Israelites. In response, God sent a series of 10 devastating plagues upon Egypt, each more severe than the last. The first plague struck the very heart of Egypt's life. The waters of the Nile, Egypt's lifeblood, turned to blood, killing fish and fouling the river. But Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. Then came a plague of frogs, overwhelming homes and streets. Afterwards, swarms of gnats filled the air, followed by clouds of flies that tormented the Egyptians. Pharaoh still refused to yield. Next, a deadly disease swept through Egypt's livestock, killing animals in droves. This was followed by painful boils that broke out on the skin of the Egyptians, causing widespread suffering. Despite the agony, Pharaoh's heart stayed hard. Then came a storm of hail, the likes of which Egypt had never seen, destroying crops and shattering buildings. What little remained after the hail was devoured by a plague of locusts that descended upon the land in a ravenous swarm. Even as Egypt lay in ruins, Pharaoh refused to let the Israelites go. God sent a ninth plague: darkness. For 3 days, Egypt was engulfed in a thick, impenetrable darkness, leaving the people in fear and confusion. But Pharaoh still did not relent. Finally, God sent the 10th and most terrible plague: the death of the firstborn. In every Egyptian household, the firstborn child died that night, from the lowest servant to Pharaoh's own son. It was a night of unimaginable grief and loss, and Pharaoh, broken by sorrow, finally ordered Moses to take the Israelites and leave Egypt. Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, their long-awaited exodus at hand. But their journey was not easy. Pharaoh, consumed by rage and regret, pursued them with his army, chasing them to the edge of the Red Sea. Trapped between the sea and Pharaoh's forces, the Israelites despaired. But Moses, trusting in God's power, raised his staff over the waters, and the sea parted, creating a dry path for the Israelites to cross. As they reached the other side, the waters closed back over Pharaoh's army, delivering the Israelites from their enemies once and for all. Now free from Egypt, the Israelites wandered the wilderness, led by Moses. At Mount Sinai, Moses ascended the mountain and received the 10 Commandments, God's sacred laws that would guide his people. These laws were a covenant between God and the Israelites, instructing them on how to live in harmony with one another and in devotion to God. But even as Moses received the commandments, the Israelites faltered in their faith. They grew impatient during Moses' long absence on the mountain and constructed a golden calf to worship. When Moses returned and saw their betrayal, he was filled with anger and smashed the stone tablets, though he later returned to the mountain to receive them again. For 40 years, Moses led the Israelites through the wilderness, a journey marked by trials, rebellions, and divine guidance. The people struggled with faith, often longing for the comforts of Egypt, but Moses remained steadfast, interceding for them before God. During this time, God provided for their needs, sending manna from heaven to feed them and water from rocks to quench their thirst. Moses grew old, and though he had led the Israelites faithfully, he was told by God that he would not enter the promised land. It was a consequence of an earlier moment of disobedience when Moses struck a rock to bring forth water rather than speaking to it as God had commanded. However, God allowed Moses to see the promised land from a distance. From the peak of Mount Nebo, Moses gazed upon the land flowing with milk and honey, the land that his people would soon inherit. Knowing his time had come, Moses blessed the people one final time and spoke to them of God's promises. Then at the age of 120, Moses passed away peacefully on the mountain, and God himself buried him in an unknown grave. His legacy endured, not just as a leader of the Israelites, but as a prophet who had spoken face to face with God. Through Moses, the Israelites were delivered from bondage and set on a path toward a future as God's chosen people.